It has been 75 days since Nancy Guthrie walked out of her life in Tucson, Arizona, and did not come back. 75 days of searches, statements, and silence where answers should be. And now, at what investigators are calling a critical juncture in the case, a strand of hair found inside her home may carry the information that changes everything. The FBI has confirmed it is actively analyzing DNA evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's residence. According to multiple sources familiar with the investigation, hair samples discovered inside the home have been classified as potentially critical to the case. Those samples are now in federal hands, moving through a laboratory process that officials say remains ongoing. No timeline for results has been publicly released, but the presence of that evidence and the agency now handling it signals that this investigation has entered a phase that is fundamentally different from what came before. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of well-known television personality Savannah Guthrie. That connection brought national attention to the case almost immediately after her disappearance was first reported in early February. Family disappearances in this country happen with heartbreaking regularity, and not all of them attract the resources or the spotlight that this one has. The Guthrie case has both. Federal involvement was established early. The attention never faded, and still, after more than 10 weeks, the central question of where Nancy Guthrie is and who is responsible for taking her remains unanswered. What investigators do have, as of this week, is physical evidence that did not exist in the public record before. Hair samples recovered from inside her home are being treated not as routine collection, but as material that could directly point to a suspect. The distinction matters enormously. It means the investigation has moved past the early phase of canvassing, interviews, and community intelligence gathering. It has entered a forensic stage that typically precedes charges. That does not mean charges are imminent. It means the work being done now is the kind of work that leads to them. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, which has primary jurisdiction over the case, confirmed on day 75 that DNA analysis is continuing. They offered no further detail. Federal involvement suggests the investigation carries a weight beyond local capacity and that authorities believe they may be closing in on something concrete. The cooperation between local and federal agencies in cases of this kind is not automatic. The FBI does not enter cases without cause. When they are processing forensic evidence in an abduction, it is because the evidence warrants the level of expertise and resources that only the Bureau can provide. What that something is, no one outside the investigation has been told. That is the nature of active investigations at this stage. The closer you get to a potential identification, the less is shared publicly. It is a controlled silence, not an absence of progress. This report covers what is known, what is developing, and what the evidence now under federal analysis could mean for the outcome of this case. Because 75 days deserves more than a headline. It deserves a complete picture of where things actually stand. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. She was 84 years old. She required daily medication. She had a pacemaker. She was taken in her pajamas without her phone, her purse, or the medication that was left in its bottles on her kitchen counter. A masked, armed individual was captured on doorbell camera footage at 1:47 in the morning. Her pacemaker disconnected from its paired phone app at 2:28. Blood confirmed to be hers was found on the front steps. That is the baseline. Everything else, every theory, every expert, every ransom note and investigative development runs through that foundation. To understand where the case stands today, it helps to understand how it arrived here and how the shape of the investigation has changed over time. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson in what authorities classified as an abduction from the very beginning of the case. That classification carries specific legal and investigative weight. It means law enforcement determined early on that this was not a voluntary departure, not a mental health crisis, and not a case of someone choosing to walk away from their life and their family. Someone took her. That conclusion shaped every resource allocation, every investigative priority, and every public statement that followed. A ransom note was reportedly recovered early in the investigation. The existence of that note was significant because it established motive, or at least the appearance of motive. It confirmed that whoever took Nancy Guthrie did so with an expectation of financial gain. It framed the case as an active kidnapping rather than a mystery with no evident purpose. It directed investigators toward the possibility of communication, of a financial demand being made, and potentially of a negotiation process. Kidnapping cases with ransom demands are among the most operationally complex that law enforcement handles, because the communication itself becomes part of the evidence, and the way investigators respond to that communication can affect the safety of the missing person. Then, weeks later, a new ransom note surfaced. The emergence of a second communication shifted the tone of the investigation in ways that matter beyond the obvious. A second note means persistence. It means whoever is behind this abduction made a deliberate decision to reach out again, weeks after the initial contact, to continue the communication. Investigators treat second communications very differently from first ones. The first establishes the frame. The second tells you whether the person behind it is committed, whether the situation is stable or deteriorating, and whether the demands have changed. In this case, a second note tells investigators that whoever took Nancy Guthrie has not simply abandoned the operation or disappeared into silence. Police responded to the second note with what officials referred to as a major move in the investigation. That language, while deliberately vague, suggests something more than a routine evidence intake. It suggests that law enforcement took concrete action in direct response to what the second note contained or revealed. Whether that action involved a change in surveillance strategy, a direct contact with a person of interest, an operational response of some kind in the field, or a combination of measures is not something authorities have publicly described. The decision to withhold that detail is entirely understandable in an active investigation. Revealing the nature of a law enforcement response to ransom communication can compromise the integrity of the operation, but it does leave the public with a significant and conspicuous blank in the timeline of what has happened. Meanwhile, investigators returned to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood, police increased patrols in the area where she lived, and residents noticed. The return of officers to streets they had already searched is a signal that bears careful analysis. In some investigations, a return to familiar geography means new information has pointed law enforcement back to a specific location. In others, it reflects community pressure and the need to maintain a visible presence in an area where residents feel unsafe and unseen. The official statement from authorities described the return as a response to both community concerns and new information, suggesting both factors may be at play simultaneously. There is a detail in that return worth noting. Investigators do not allocate patrols casually. If they are going back to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood, there is a reason rooted in the investigation itself. That reason might come from the second ransom note. It might come from witness information that has recently surfaced. It might come from the DNA results now being processed by the FBI, which may point towards someone with a documented or suspected connection to the neighborhood. Without confirmation from authorities, the interpretation remains open. But the return itself is not incidental and should not be dismissed as merely symbolic. The DNA evidence now under examination is the most significant development in the case in recent weeks, and it deserves specific and detailed attention. Hair samples were recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Sources familiar with the investigation have described those samples as potentially critical, a characterization that places them well above the standard threshold of being simply useful or interesting. Critical means investigators believe this material could directly identify who was present in that home in a context connected to the abduction. That is not a minor finding. It is the kind of finding that can change the entire direction and pace of a case. The timing of when these samples were collected relative to when they were flagged as significant is also worth noting. In major investigations, forensic evidence is sometimes collected early, but not elevated in priority until other investigative avenues have been explored. The decision to process these samples at the federal level and to describe them publicly as potentially critical suggests that investigators have reached a point in the case where the forensic evidence is now their primary forward path. Other avenues may have been pursued and found insufficient. The hair samples may now represent the clearest route to identifying a suspect. While the forensic process continues inside federal laboratories, the public face of this investigation has not been without friction. And in a case this closely watched by this many people, the public face matters almost as much as the investigative reality happening behind it. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, which has led the local response to this case, is now under pressure from multiple directions. Former associates of the current sheriff have used language in public commentary that goes well beyond ordinary professional disagreement. One former superior described the sheriff in terms that pointed to a pattern of personal conduct rather than to a policy disagreement or a resource failure. The word used was vindictive. The characterization applied was bully. Those are not words that emerge from a debate over investigative methodology or departmental budget allocation. They are words chosen to describe a person's character, and they were chosen by someone who claims to have worked directly alongside the current sheriff over a significant period of time. That characterization was reported widely. It has not been formally addressed by the sheriff's office. The absence of a response is itself meaningful in a public context. When a former superior makes statements of this kind during an active, nationally watched investigation, the typical institutional response is some form of rebuttal or clarification. The decision not to engage publicly either reflects a calculation that engaging would amplify the criticism beyond its current reach, or it reflects an inability to construct a response that would be credible to the public already following the case. Neither of those possibilities projects confidence. A separate incident added to the tension surrounding the department and drew its own sustained wave of public reaction. An alert was sent out that contained the message that Nancy Guthrie had been located. The phrasing was clear and direct. For anyone who received it, who has been following this case, who has been living alongside the question of where Nancy Guthrie is, those words had a meaning that required no interpretation. She was found, the search ended, the family had news. That was not what had happened. The alert was not accurate in the way those words universally communicate, whether it represented a miscommunication within the department, a failure in the review process that is supposed to catch errors before public distribution, or a judgment call that someone made without sufficient consideration of how it would land. The incident drew immediate and sustained criticism from observers across the country. People who had experienced what they believed was a moment of resolution were pulled back into the uncertainty they had been living with for over 2 months. That is not a small thing to do to a community and a national audience that is emotionally invested in this case. The sheriff's office has not provided a full explanation of how the message was generated, who reviewed it before it was sent, what it was actually intended to communicate, and why the clarification that followed was less precise than the original message. A correction was issued, an explanation was not. In the context of this case, that distinction matters. A correction tells people the previous statement was wrong. An explanation tells people what happened, why it happened, and what guarantees exist against it happening again. The public received one of those two things. It did not receive the other. In any investigation of this duration and profile, the relationship between law enforcement and the community it is serving depends on a basic foundational level of trust. When that trust is damaged by a communication failure of this kind, the repair does not happen automatically. It requires visible accountability and a change in behavior over time. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is currently operating in an environment of reduced public confidence, and that environment does not simply reset because the next news cycle moves on. The federal investigation continues regardless. The FBI is not subject to the same community dynamics that affect a county sheriff's department. Their laboratory work is insulated from local credibility problems. But the local dimension of any investigation requires cooperation, community engagement, and a public that trusts what it is being told. Creating skepticism around official communications makes all of that harder to sustain. There is no indication that the federal investigation has been directly compromised by these events. But the atmosphere around the case has shifted, and that shift has real consequences for how the community experiences and engages with the ongoing investigation. If you are following this case and have found this analysis helpful, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next update as developments continue. There is a complication inside the forensic work that has not gone unnoticed, and it deserves careful attention because it directly affects the timeline for everything that comes next. The hair samples recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home produced what sources described as mixed DNA results. This is a technical finding, and it has significant practical implications for the pace of the investigation. Mixed profiles are not uncommon in forensic analysis, particularly in a residential setting where multiple individuals may have been present over time. A home is not a sterile environment. It accumulates the biological material of everyone who has moved through it, lived in it, worked in it, or visited it over any period of time. Hair sheds naturally and can persist in interior spaces for extended periods. The presence of more than one person's genetic material on a collected sample is not surprising in a setting like a private residence, but mixed profiles do complicate and significantly extend the time required for a definitive analysis. The FBI has experienced delays in completing the hair sample analysis specifically because of that complexity. A mixed DNA result means that more than one person's genetic material is present on a single sample or distributed across multiple samples collected from the residents. Separating those profiles, determining which components of the genetic signature belong to which individual, and producing a clean result that can stand up to legal scrutiny All of that requires additional laboratory work that cannot be rushed without compromising the outcome. To understand what this means in practice, it helps to understand how mixed profile analysis actually works. When a forensic laboratory is dealing with a mixed profile, the primary analytical tool is a method called probabilistic genotyping. This is a computational statistical approach that uses mathematical modeling to estimate the probability that a specific individual contributed to a given mixed sample. The process involves modeling all possible combinations of contributor profiles that could plausibly produce the observed genetic signature, and then calculating the likelihood ratio for each possible scenario. Modern probabilistic genotyping software used by the FBI is extremely sophisticated, and results generated by this process have been accepted in federal courts in the United States. The challenge is that this process is time-intensive. The more complex the mixture, meaning the more contributors there may be, the longer the modeling process runs. Each additional possible contributor multiplies the number of scenarios that must be evaluated. And before any of this statistical work can produce a meaningful result, investigators need comparison samples from people who had legitimate or suspected access to the space. Those comparison samples are used as reference points in the probabilistic analysis. Without them, the modeling cannot tell investigators whether the profile they extracted matches a specific individual. Whether reference samples have been collected from persons of interest in this case is not information that law enforcement has shared publicly. The decision about when to collect reference DNA from a person connected to an investigation is a strategic one. If a potential suspect becomes aware that their DNA has been requested for comparison, they know how close investigators are to identifying them. In some cases, that awareness causes people to flee. In others, it creates legal complications. The timing is deliberate. It is not something investigators communicate publicly, and there is a good reason for that. What the delay does not mean is that the evidence has been weakened or that the investigation has stalled in any meaningful way. Mixed profiles have been successfully resolved in many cases before this one, including cases where the initial genetic picture was far more complex than what has been publicly described in the Guthrie investigation. The timeline is longer than the outside world would prefer. But the integrity of the analysis and the value of a clean result when it arrives is not diminished by the extra time required to get there correctly. There is something else worth understanding about what a successfully resolved mixed profile means for a prosecution. When genetic analysis can cleanly separate a mixed profile and match one component to a specific identified individual, that match constitutes among the most powerful forensic evidence available in the American legal system. It places the identified person's biological material in a specific location at a time relevant to the crime. It is direct physical evidence of presence when combined with other elements of an investigation, such as the ransom notes, any surveillance materials that may exist, witness accounts from people in the neighborhood, financial records, and communications data. A clean DNA identification can form the evidentiary backbone of a case that is exceptionally difficult to challenge in court. The FBI's involvement ensures that the most advanced laboratory resources available to American law enforcement are being applied to this material. The agency's forensic division processes thousands of mixed profile samples annually and has continuously refined its probabilistic genotyping methods over the past 2 decades. There is no comparable forensic resource at the county level in Pima County or anywhere else in the state. The decision to bring this analysis to the federal level was the right one, both for the quality of the result and for the credibility of whatever evidentiary value it produces in a future legal proceeding. 75 days in, the waiting continues. But the waiting now has a direction. It is pointing at a laboratory. And in that laboratory, answers may already be taking shape that no one outside the building yet knows. Savannah Guthrie, whose public life has continued even as her private reality has been profoundly upended for more than 2 months, left her morning program mid-broadcast this week. The departure was unplanned, visible to anyone watching at the time, and prompted immediate speculation from viewers who have been following her mother's case and who understand the context of what her family is experiencing. No official explanation was provided at the time of the departure. Whether the exit was connected to developments in her mother's case or was entirely unrelated is not something that has been confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge of the situation. For a family navigating this at the highest possible level of sustained public attention, every visible moment carries weight it would not otherwise carry. A departure from a live broadcast becomes a signal that an audience reads and interprets through the lens of what it already knows about the family's situation. That is the reality of this case for everyone connected to it. There is no private space available to process what is happening without it being observed and assigned a meaning. There is no quiet moment that does not eventually become visible and public. That kind of sustained, involuntary transparency is its own burden, distinct from everything else the family is carrying. A journalist who has been closely tracking this case publicly disclosed this week that there is a specific question he has been wanting to put to Savannah Guthrie directly, one he has not yet had the opportunity to ask. He did not identify the nature of that question. The disclosure was nevertheless enough to signal that those closest to this story professionally believe there are dimensions of Savannah Guthrie's perspective and knowledge that the public has not yet accessed. Whether that reflects information she has received from investigators about the current state of the case, her own private observations and recollections about events preceding her mother's disappearance, or simply her personal assessment of a situation she is living through without any special informational advantage, it is not possible to know without that conversation taking place. Families in cases of this kind are routinely asked by law enforcement to limit what they say publicly during an active investigation. There are multiple legitimate reasons for this practice. Statements made publicly and on the record can reach a suspect and alert them to the extent of what investigators know. They can affect the testimony of witnesses who have not yet been formally interviewed and who are susceptible to outside influence. They can complicate the media management of critical moments in the investigation when precision matters. Whether Savannah Guthrie is operating under any specific guidance from investigators about public communication is not something that has been disclosed. Her public comments about her mother's situation have been consistently and carefully limited. Looking at the full picture of where this case stands today, the neighborhood where Nancy Guthrie lived is being patrolled again. The FBI is actively processing evidence recovered from her home. A second ransom note has entered the investigation and has prompted a significant law enforcement response. The local agency responsible for managing the case is facing questions about its conduct and its communication that have not been fully and satisfactorily answered. And federal forensic analysts are working through a technical challenge that is extending the timeline but not diminishing the potential significance of what they may find. None of those facts, taken individually, constitutes resolution. Taken together, they describe an investigation that is active, that has produced material physical evidence, and that is moving through a phase that typically and historically precedes a significant development. Whether that development comes in a week or several weeks is not something that can be determined from outside the process. The FBI does not share its internal laboratory timelines. The Sheriff's Department has provided no forward guidance, and the family, by necessity or by choice, has said very little. What is known is this. There was a woman in Tucson, Arizona, who was taken from her home. Someone recovered hair samples from that home that federal agents believe may identify who. Someone is communicating through ransom notes that confirm this situation has an ongoing, active dimension. Investigators have made moves in response to those communications, and the case is on day 75, still open, still moving, still without the answer that everyone is waiting for. Whether Nancy Guthrie is still alive, where she is, and who is responsible for her disappearance. Those are the questions that every piece of this investigation is pointed toward. They were the questions on day one. They remain the questions today. Not forgotten, not abandoned, open.